The Gandhian Forum seeks to promote dialogue and education on some of the most challenging issues that confront the human race, resolving conflicts, eliminating war, and advancing the cause of social justice. We hope that we can help make this campus a place where such conversations flourish and a catalyst for encouraging engagement with these concerns in the wider community. The Gandhian Forum was established in September 2008 thanks to a generous grant from Professor Eswar Fadia of the WPU Math Department. Professor Fadia is retiring from William Paterson this year, but he is leaving behind an organization that we hope will be making a major contribution to peace and justice for many years to come. Today we are presenting a program on the topic of immigration. Before I introduce our speaker, however, I'd like to first present to you Kathleen Waldron, the president of William Paterson University, to make a few welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Juan Gonzalez, for being with us today, and for students coming inside on such a gorgeous day. I know, but it's going to be very worth your while. I just wanted to acknowledge the role that the Gandhian Forum plays at William Paterson University since its foundation, and will continue to play in the future as we talk about issues of justice and peace and equity throughout our campus and throughout our nation. The dialogue and conversation right now about immigration in the United States is one that many of us have waited a long, long time for, particularly in an institution like William Paterson University, a public institution of higher education, where even the way we accept students and charge students fees and tuition is determined often by their legal status in the country or our perception of legal status in the country, which is mandated by state laws, not necessarily by choice of an institution. We hope going forward that our immigration laws in the United States will seek justice for so many, particularly young people in this country who are here. And I'm very interested personally, given my background in Latin America and Latin American-U.S. relations, in hearing Juan Gonzalez's talk today. So thank you all for joining us and for participating, and for the students who will form the panel commentators. We appreciate your participation as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. One of the issues that's gripped our country since its inception has been the question of immigration. The topic evokes passionate discussion, and indeed, as we meet here today, the U.S. Congress is vigorously debating the issue. One of the people best qualified to discuss this topic is Juan Gonzalez. He has been a journalist for more than 30 years and a staff columnist for the New York Daily News since 1987. He is a two-time recipient of the George Polk Award for commentary, one of journalism's most prestigious awards. And he's also the co-host of the award-winning daily radio and television news program, Democracy Now!, which I listen to every morning as I'm driving to campus. Juan Gonzalez is a founder and past president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists and a member of the organization's Hall of Fame. A founding member of the Young Lords Party in the 1970s and of the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights in the 1980s, Mr. Gonzalez has twice been named by Hispanic Business Magazine as one of the country's most influential Hispanics, and has received Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, the National Council of La Raza, and the National Puerto Rican Coalition. He's the author of 4 books and is featured in a documentary film on immigration based on one of his books. It's available in the library, so you can all see it and learn from it. Mr. Gonzalez will speak for about 45 minutes and then take your questions. At 2 o'clock in this same room, we will have a panel of students from 7 different majors who will comment on Mr. Gonzalez's presentation, and then he will offer a response. So if you can stay with us until 3:15, you'll be in for what we hope is quite an engaging afternoon. And now it gives me great pleasure to present to you Juan Gonzalez.
Thank you, and good afternoon, and thanks to President Waldron and Steve Shalom and the Gandhi Forum for inviting me to share some thoughts with you on what is becoming not only a huge political issue in the country, but it is, I believe, one of the pressing human rights issues of our time here in the United States. I'm going to give you a little bit prepared remarks and then some other off-the-cuff remarks about this topic. I've always considered myself more of a professional journalist than a historian, having devoted nearly 35 years now to chronicling day-to-day events in the areas of urban politics, economics, crime and law enforcement, labor, and race relations, what in my profession we typically refer to as hard news. I'm such a hard news junkie that I rarely pay even much attention to the world of entertainment media, except to occasionally reflect on how it has shaped or at times distorted national consciousness, national identity, and the broader culture. But throughout my career, I've been acutely aware of the extraordinary role news media play in creating the memory bank of any nation. The incidents the media choose to report, their interpretations of events, inevitably serve as raw material that is then mined by scholars who come decades or centuries later to chisel more comprehensive historical accounts. When I attended public schools in New York City during the 1950s and the early 1960s, the history books were far different than they are today. It was as if the only things worth recording back then, when it came to heroic figures, politics, science, literature, art, and industry, was what had happened in Europe or among the descendants of those European settlers who ventured out to colonize and settle enclaves in the Western Hemisphere, Africa, and Asia. The overwhelming majority of our planet, the non-white peoples, were still seen as shrouded in darkness or at least some inferior form of cultural development. As someone born in Puerto Rico, but raised all my life in the United States, I learned nothing in school about my own homeland, a US territory and perhaps the most valuable overseas possession the United States has ever held. And so it was for so many Mexican, Cuban, Dominican, Salvadoran, Guatemalan, Honduran, Colombian, Panamanian children who, like myself, grew up right here in the US. Likewise for millions of African Americans, Native Americans, and Asian children. The stirring immigrant saga of settlers conquering the West to create the world's greatest democratic experiment somehow excluded those of us who had not come from Europe. Most importantly, the news media we grew up with kept depicting us as threats to society rather than contributors. West Side Story, one of the great Broadway musicals and films in the nation's history, ingrained in millions of Americans the stereotype of a Puerto Rican as a gang member with a knife and slicked back hair, just as Birth of a Nation, decades before, had shaped images of Black Americans as lusting after white women and prone to crime. The invariable lurid stories of Black and Latino criminals produced by my own colleagues, many exaggerated, some vastly distorted, infuriated me. But I knew from the experiences and stories of my own family and other hardworking Latinos that the news and entertainment media accounts, the history books, were incomplete, one-sided, and out of context. Even after I'd graduated from Columbia University and embarked on a career in journalism, I couldn't understand why, despite all the progress in civil rights and equal opportunity the past 50 years, the news media keep depicting racial and ethnic minorities in such a one-sided, stereotypical, and negative manner, or why they continue to provoke such anger, resentment, and disdain from broad swaths of the American people. So I made up my mind years ago to embark on my own journey into the historical record, to search for materials that textbooks and previous scholars had overlooked. The first product of that search was Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America. It was initially published in 2000, issued in a revised and updated edition in 2011. To my complete surprise, given that I was a working journalist making my first foray into writing history, the book has become so popular that it's now used in nearly 200 college courses across the country as a required text. A few years ago, a group of Latino filmmakers in Washington approached me with their proposal to create a full-length documentary based on the book. It took almost as long for them to make the film, 7 years, as it took for me to research and write the original book. But their production premiered in New York and Los Angeles last fall to sold-out audiences and is now, it received glowing reviews in the LA Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Hollywood Reporter, and other press outlets, and it's now been opening throughout the United States. Some of you may have seen a screening here on campus in recent days, and it could not have come at a more important time as our nation begins not the first huge debate over immigration, but the latest huge debate over immigration. Because those of us who do not study our history sufficiently will not understand that this has been a recurring controversy throughout American history. Who gets to be legitimately in the country? Under what conditions? The first great battle occurred in the 1850s with the Know-Nothings attempting to limit Irish immigration into the country, to expand the number of years it would take for the Irish immigrants to become citizens, to deny them the right to vote in local elections. There was a huge battle previous to the Civil War over the Irish immigration. It was then replaced by the battle in the late 1800s over Chinese immigration, as exclusionists sought to prevent Chinese from entering the country, succeeded in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act, overwhelmingly approved by the United States Congress to deny any Chinese entry into the United States, the first actually racist immigration law in the United States, which pretty much held sway, not just for the Chinese, but for Japanese and other Asian immigrants until 1942, when President Roosevelt, in the midst of World War II, needing the support of Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist Chinese, fighting Japanese occupation, agreed to end the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was followed numerous times by efforts to not only recruit Mexicans into the country, but to ship them back out of the country. In the 1930s, under President Hoover, in the 1950s, Operation Wetback. It was followed by the 1960s, I forgot one of the most important, the 1920s immigration debate, which sought to prevent more immigration of Italians, of Polish, and of Russian Jews into the country by establishing quotas in the 1920s that limited immigration to the percentages of people that had lived in the country in the 19th century. But it was a direct attempt to prevent the Italians, the Polish, and the Russian Jews from entering the country. Then comes the first Mexican attempts at mass deportations. Then comes the 65 battle, the immigration battle in 65 that created the current immigration system that we have today. And then, of course, the 86 first, quote, amnesty under President Reagan. There have been repeated battles in American history over the question of who gets to be an American. Because we are a country of immigrants, and of course, as far as the Native Americans are concerned, everyone is illegal. Everyone is illegally in the country, and repeatedly illegally in the country, because every treaty the settlers made with the Native Americans, they then proceeded to break and enter into their lands illegally. So this whole issue of immigration is really an issue, and the battle we're having now today is an issue over what will the United States of America look like in the 21st century. That's what's at stake in the discussion that is now occurring in Congress. And largely, this is a discussion that centers around a new group in the equation, the Latino population of the United States, which of course has grown at an astounding level over the last 50 or 60 years. If the projections continue, by 2040, 2045, the Census Bureau estimates that Latinos will comprise about a third of the entire population of the country, about 130 million of about 400 million projected population at that time. And if you look out a little further, beyond 2050, it's entirely possible that by the end of this century, a half or more of the entire population of the United States will trace its origins not to Europe, but to Latin America. That is an enormous demographic transformation in the very composition of the nation. When I first wrote Harvest of Empire, I understood that that was happening. And so I was trying to write a book for the future generations, not for that current generation, for them to understand how this had come about. The film, like the book, tells the complex and largely untold story of the various Latino groups that have migrated to the United States, a subject that is especially timely given, first, the recent presidential elections and the debate that will now come to a climax this year over comprehensive immigration reform. Even as we speak here, thousands of people are in Washington today in a protest aimed at pressuring Congress to act. And later this week, or early next week, a bipartisan group of US senators known as the Gang of Eight, led by New York Senior Senator Chuck Schumer, will introduce their own proposal for comprehensive immigration reform. And I will get into that debate in a moment. But first, I just want to highlight a few of the themes that both my book and the film attempt to add to this discussion of immigration. Both seek to go beyond the stereotypes and the sound bites that we have grown accustomed to hearing in the media about Latino immigration, about the illegal aliens, about the anchor babies, about the people that are here basically to mooch off American prosperity. It does so by examining not only the gripping accounts of individual migrants, the immense contributions Latinos have made to American prosperity, but most importantly, by laying bare for the first time on film the forces in Latin America that drove so many Latinos to come to the United States. One of the key points I tried to make in the book and in the film is that America is changing dramatically in its racial composition and its ethnic composition as a result of previous government policies. And that we are not the only country in the world that is facing this immigration crisis. In England, they don't know what to do about all the Pakistanis and the Indians and the Jamaicans. In France, they are having major battles over the role of Algerians and Tunisians and Moroccans in French society. In Germany, they're confronting a huge influx, and have been for decades, of Turks. And in the United States, the huge problem and change in the population has largely been of Latin Americans and Caribbean peoples, and increasingly now also Asians and Africans. The reality is that over the last 50 years, the third world has come to the West. And the folks have gone precisely to their former colonial masters. The reason there are so many Algerians and Tunisians and Moroccans in France is because those were the colonies of France. The reason why there are so many Indians and Pakistanis and Jamaicans in England is because those were the colonies of England. And the reason there are so many Latin Americans in the United States is because that was the incubator and the base of the American empire. All the great multinationals began in Latin America. And the amount of impact that those countries had in the 19th and early 20th century in those countries is a major reason why there have been so many migrant flows. And not just migrant flows to the United States. American companies have literally changed the nature of some of the countries in Latin America. My best example is Panama. Panama was a nation created by the United States. Teddy Roosevelt was trying to build the Panama Canal, and he couldn't get Colombia, because Panama used to be a province of Colombia, he couldn't get the Colombian government to agree to allow the United States to build this immense project called the Panama Canal. So Roosevelt aided and abetted and conspired with some local Panamanians to declare an independent Panama and have the United States then secure this independence of the new country. Immediately signed a treaty with the new Panamanian government to build the Panama Canal. And between 1904 and 1914, the US Panama Canal Company imported 35,000 West Indians, Jamaicans, and Barbadians to go to Panama to build the canal. It was built by West Indians and Barbadians, thousands of whom died in the process of building that canal. But in the process, it changed the very composition of the nation of Panama. It represented a third, the immigrants represented a third of the existing population of Panama. They were Protestant and English speaking, while Panama was largely Catholic and Spanish speaking. Completely transformed the country, all to meet the needs of building a legitimately important engineering, one of the wonders of the world, the Panama Canal. I don't know how many people have ever seen it. It's really an extraordinary accomplishment. But it was primarily a need of American businesses to be able to get trade from one ocean to the other. And likewise, thousands of Haitians were recruited by American sugar plantations in Cuba to come to Cuba to work. My own grandfather, Puerto Rican, was recruited to go to work in the sugar mills of the Dominican Republic by the US Puerto Rico Sugar Company. So all of these massive transfers of labor were occurring all to meet the needs of a growing American empire. And of course then, the entire southwestern United States, which used to be part of Mexico, that contributed so much to American prosperity. The labor of the West throughout much of the late 19th century and early 20th century was basically Mexican labor, either of the original Mexicans that were on the land when it was conquered and annexed, or of migrant workers that were recruited up because there weren't enough workers in the West to work the copper mines of Arizona, or to work the sheep herding industry of New Mexico, or the cattle industry of Texas, or the gold and silver mines of Nevada and California. So Mexican labor was imported to do all that work, in addition to helping run the railroads after the Chinese had largely built them on the western spur of the transcontinental railroads. So this Latino presence began in that period, but it accelerated dramatically after World War II. And it accelerated as well because of the various adventures that our government got into over the years that developed particular relationships with several countries: the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Salvador, and all of this is detailed in the film. And the amount of people that were directly recruited. I remember in the 1970s living in Aguadilla in Puerto Rico, and I would hear the sound trucks through the streets of Aguadilla on the western end of Puerto Rico. Come to work in the United States, all expenses paid. Come to the town square and sign up. The recruitment process that occurred to bring Puerto Ricans to work in the fields, in the Vineland, New Jersey. Why are there so many Latinos in South Jersey? Because they were originally recruited to pick the crops, and they were recruited directly from Puerto Rico to pick the crops. Why are there so many Latinos in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania? Because in the 1950s, Bethlehem Steel hired contractors to go to the Mexican border and recruit people to come work in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Same time with Youngstown Tube and Sheet and the development of the Latino community in Ohio. So a lot of the development of the Latino communities in many parts of the country were a result of direct recruitment to meet the cheap labor needs of American industry. And so that is how these communities have developed, and that is part of sort of the untold story of the, like people say, well, I hear this all the time. How did so many Latinos suddenly in my city? And I'm not talking about New York, Los Angeles. I'm talking about Dodge City, Kansas, or Dalton, Georgia, or Des Moines, or all these other places that never had Latino populations before. And if you trace back the origins of the communities, you will find that most of them began as a result of direct labor recruitment by American businesses to get lower wage workers in their communities. The only problem is the workers put their wives and their children started going to the public school, and before you knew it, and then they got cousins and aunts and uncles to come, and that developed the entire community. So it's in this context that we have to understand the current debate that is occurring. Between March and May of 2006, and the current debate we're having came to the forefront between March and May of 2006. That was when the country was suddenly confronted with the largest series of mass protests in the nation's history on any issue. Between March and May of 2006, some 3 to 5 million people poured into the streets of virtually every major city and small town in America. 500,000 people in Los Angeles, 200,000 in Dallas, 50,000 in Denver, 20,000 in Nashville, 200,000 in Chicago, 250,000 in New York. Huge protests of immigrants. They went into the streets originally because there was a bill being proposed by James Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin, who was proposing to make it a felony for any American to assist an undocumented immigrant in any way, whether in school or as a social worker or whatever, and to make it a felony for anyone to be in the country illegally. And it was such a draconian law that the immigrant community basically rose up. And people walked off their jobs. Many factories had to close down at different points during that period of time. Businesses closed down in boycotts. And it was really the coming of age of the Latino community in the United States. I tell people that March to May of 2006 was the equivalent of the sit-in protests of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, or the anti-war protests by white college students across the country in the 1970s. It was the coming of age of an entire community that until that point had been largely invisible and stereotyped. And the dreamers that we see today were little kids marching in those protests with their parents, or just in school still, because so many of the kitchen workers and the nannies and the slaughterhouse workers and the restaurant workers that went out for the first time in a protest, those during that time brought their children with them and brought their whole church delegations with them. And so that really was the awakening of that entire community. It also signaled a shift in the political reality of the United States, because there were millions of American citizen Latinos, of permanent resident Latinos, who were infuriated by the tenor of press coverage during those days of the Lou Dobbs and the Bill Rileys and the Glenn Becks and the Hannitys and all the others that were constantly vilifying the Latino immigrants. And so they ended up really standing up for the first time and demanding to be treated with respect. So in 2006, the Latino citizens started voting in astounding numbers. They had voted previously, but not to the level that they did starting in 2006. And what happened was the House of Representatives and the Senate turned Democratic. And if you trace the votes and the states that the changes occurred in, it was largely an influence of this new militancy among Latino voters. That was in 2006. Then in 2008, a young Illinois senator launches a presidential campaign with the slogan, "Yes, we can." Those of you who have studied your history know that "Yes, we can" was the slogan of Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers. "Si se puede." He appropriated the Cesar Chavez slogan as the slogan of his campaign, and only the Latinos understood where that slogan came from. And the result was this extraordinary increase in the Latino vote and this increasing shift of the Latino vote for the Democrats and President Obama. That was further intensified in the last election in 2012, when even more Latinos came out to vote, and they voted even more, at a higher percentage than they had in the 2008 election for President Obama. And at that point, the whole country recognized that an extraordinary political shift was happening. It was a political shift that may be as important as the original Republican strategy to capture the South in the 1960s of Barry Goldwater and then of Richard Nixon, by pulling white Southerners away from the Democratic Party and into the Republican Party. This shift may turn out to be as significant in terms of the direction of the country as a result of the fact that one party came to be more associated with a humane immigration policy, and one became more associated with a restrictionist immigration policy. So now, the enlightened people of the Republican Party, recognizing the demographic numbers and the reality that they could possibly be becoming a permanent minority party in the country, have now decided that they've got to shift gears and they've got to have some kind of immigration reform. Got to somehow or other stop this tidal wave that is changing the political landscape of the country. So now everyone is talking about immigration reform, but that's where the real deal comes in. Now you have to pay attention to the details. The devil is in the details. Everyone is talking immigration reform, but everyone has a different idea of what immigration reform means. And we've already been inculcated with the sound bites by my colleagues in the media. You don't know it, you've already digested the program. Right? It is learn English, secure the borders, get to the back of the line, pay a fine. Right? That any immigrant that wants to have a legal status in the country has to fulfill all these things. Okay, what do you mean by that? Because remember, and I get this all the time at the Daily News, what don't you understand about illegal? Right? That's what some of the readers, the civil ones, tell me. And these people are in the country illegally. First of all, let's understand, immigration law is not the Ten Commandments. It's not a question that is written in stone that everyone agrees with. In fact, immigration law, as I said before, is constantly changing. And in some cases, when the Chinese were declared illegal, that was the law, but it wasn't right. When the Italians and the Polish and the Russian Jews were being excluded, it was the law, but it wasn't right. So we're talking about policy, a policy that depends very much on the balance of forces in Congress at any particular time. So the issue of secure the borders, for instance, everyone agrees that the United States border should be secure, especially in a time of terrorism, and the growth of terrorism aimed at the United States. But last year, the United States government spent $17.9 billion on border security. $17.9 billion on border security. That is more than the entire combined budgets of the FBI, of the U.S. Marshal Service, of the Drug Enforcement Administration, of the DEA, of the Secret Service, and of the Bureau of Alcohol, Firearms, and Tobacco. 5 federal domestic law enforcement agencies spent $14 billion combined. $17.9 billion was spent on border enforcement. Last year, more than 50% of all federal prosecutions by all the U.S. attorneys in the United States were immigration related. Right? Basically, misdemeanors and some felonies, but largely misdemeanor prosecutions of people in the country undocumented. 50%. We spend more time trying to find and deport working immigrants than we do going after drug dealers, going after money launderers, going after gun runners, going after major criminals, the federal government does. An extraordinary expenditure of federal funds to basically make up for the fact that our immigration policy is, needs total overhaul. Why do I say that's the basic fact? Because obviously people, again, talk about this 11 million undocumented. 2/3 of all the undocumented in the United States come from one country, Mexico. 2/3. I've always believed undocumented immigration is a binational problem, essentially, between the United States and Mexico. But it's considered a problem, a much wider problem. So the issue of these laws now requiring people to get to the back of the line has a special meaning for Mexicans because everyone would agree that nobody who is in the country illegally should get to jump over the front of the line to someone who is in another country, has been waiting patiently for years to be admitted legally into the United States. We all agree. That shouldn't happen. That's not fair. The problem is that the way our immigration policy is now structured, certain countries always have a huge demand for people to come into the United States. If you are from Sri Lanka, if you are from Chad, if you are from some other country in the world, there's not a long line of people seeking to come to the United States. There's 4 countries that always max out on their immigration caps, which the United States in '65 established caps that no nation could send more than 7% of the total immigration quota for that year into the United States. So there are 4 countries that always max out on their 7% cap. They are China and India, the 2 most populous countries in the world, Mexico and the Philippines, those 4 countries. The line for those countries is far longer than anyone else. The Mexican line is the longest. Right now, there are people in Mexico who have been legally waiting online to be admitted into the United States for 20 years. That's how long the line is from Mexico. So if you are going to tell 2/3 of the undocumented who are Mexicans to get to the back of the line, you're telling them to get back to the longest line of all. And you're telling them they're going to have to wait 25, 30 years to have a chance to have a pathway to citizenship unless you also change the country caps, unless you increase the country caps to respond to where the demand is greatest in China, India, Mexico, and the Philippines, so that you can deal with the backlog. Otherwise, immigration reform will be a sham for 2/3 of the people that are involved. So that's why you got to pay attention to the details. What will happen not only to get to the back of the line, but what will happen to the country caps on immigration that now exist. Another thing that's talked about a lot is you got to learn English. Well, everyone agrees that to become an American citizen, you've got to have a rudimentary knowledge of English as well as civics to be properly exercise your duties as a citizen. However, for the first time, it's being proposed that you must learn English just to become a permanent resident, not to become a citizen. Because the way that this immigration reform is being talked about, if you're undocumented, you will get a temporary status. It will take you 2 years or so to prove that you're in temporary status. Then you may have to wait 8 or 10 years to become a permanent resident. Then another 5 years to become a citizen. So that it's already a very long time. But if you start requiring English proficiency just to become a permanent resident, first of all, you're doing an unprecedented thing that's never been done before. But 2, you are also forcing an enormous cost. The Migration Policy Institute estimates that there are 3.8 to 5.8 million people who are undocumented, who, if that requirement was imposed on them, would not be able to meet it without going through English literacy classes. It would cost between $6 and $12 billion. for the cost of those classes to that huge migrant population. The federal government last year spent about $60 million on adult, the entire government spent about $60 million on adult literacy, adult English as a second language classes. So who's going to pay for that? And why is it necessary for permanent residents as opposed to just for citizens to become a citizen? So that's why when you hear learn English, what do you mean? Are you talking about learn English to become a citizen, learn English to become a permanent resident? What do you mean? When you say get to the back of the line, what do you mean? When you say secure the borders first, what do you mean? If we're already spending $17.9 billion, how much more do we have to spend before the borders are secure enough to admit people into the country? So these are all the issues. Pay a fine, well, yeah, pay a fine, but are you going to pay a fine, or are you going to pay all your back taxes? And if you've been, depending on how much time you've been in the country, you're talking tens of thousands of dollars for people who, they're lucky if they make $10,000 or $15,000 a year. So these are all the issues that are going to be debated just on the issue of the undocumented. But there's several other issues in this immigration reform that you need to pay attention to, because it's not just about the undocumented. It's about the future labor flow into the country. It's about what America will look like in the future. And that is represented by three proposals that will have to do with labor flow. One is the issue of agricultural workers. Last year, American farms had a 25% shortage of agricultural workers to pick the crops. So the new proposal will establish a new blue card, not just a green card, there'll be a blue card for agricultural workers, supposedly. This is one of the things being talked about, where if you work for at least 150 days in the fields for 3 years, you could, you'll first have a blue card to be able to do that, but then you can also have an expedited route to citizenship. You won't have to do all the line stuff that the other folks are being, who are here in the country. You'd get a fast track to citizenship. I mean, to first legal status, permanent residency, and then citizenship. So what in effect is doing is agribusiness is taking advantage of the immigration reform situation, one, to solve their labor problem, but at the same time to induce people to become farm workers, you know, to become low-paid farm workers. Now, the battle that's going on between the labor unions right now is what will be the salary levels of these farm workers, what will be the job protections of these farm workers. Will a person, because they have to be sponsored by an employer, if you're sponsored by an employer, are you at the mercy of that employer, or will your blue card have portability? Will you be able to move to another job after a period of time in the farms? So these are all issues that have to be resolved in the details of the coming legislation. The other part of it is a new thing called the W visa. The W visa will be for other low-wage workers, hotel workers, maintenance workers, service maintenance workers, and other non-seasonal workers, low-skilled workers, will be allowed into the country, sponsored by their employers. So this is expanding the agricultural guest worker program to a larger group of people. But again, the issue of what kind of labor protections will they have? Will they have portability? And they're talking about as many as 200,000 people. They'll start at 20,000 a year, but it could go up to 200,000 a year to be admitted into the country under this new W visa program. And the final one, and the one that many of you should probably pay attention to, because this is more or less in the class of folks that you are heading into, is the H-1B, or the technical scientific visas. Right now, there's about 85,000 people allowed into the country every year on H-1B visas. There's already some degree of abuse of these by employers who want to hire software engineers, and largely from India and China and some from Turkey, and then pay them lower wages here in the United States than they pay American workers, but yet at the same time charge the governments and the companies that they contract with huge amounts of money, and they pocket the difference. So there's already an abuse in that. But now Silicon Valley and corporate America wants a dramatic increase in their ability to basically perpetuate a brain drain on the third world, right? To take the people who were educated in India and China and Turkey and induce them to come here for certainly more money than we're making there, but less than what folks in the United States are already being paid. The corporate America wants a total ending of the cap. It probably will end up being about 200, 400,000, but it's a huge increase. And there are enormous potential for abuse because, for instance, if you are a graduate student in science and technology, you can get into the country and move quickly to become a permanent resident. What could that open up? That could open up huge abuse of online and for-profit universities, basically finding a way to get people who have the money in other countries to come in as a backdoor to quickly enter the United States, just because they have the money to do it. So we are in danger, depending on how this legislation occurs, to switching our immigration policy from one that said, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free, to one that says, give me your well-educated, your affluent, and those who can afford to pay to get into the United States. And this is an enormous challenge to our vision of the country that we are and the opportunities that America holds out to the rest of the world. So these are all issues that are going to end up being resolved in legislation that will first be introduced in the Senate this week, and then the House of Representatives will have another version, which probably may not even include a real path to citizenship, but then will have to be reconciled in a reconciliation discussion and eventually signed by the president sometime in the fall of this year. It is an important debate over the future of America. And I encourage all of you to pay attention, to look to the details, to make your voices heard on what you think are the way that some of these questions should be resolved. Don't let others do it for you. And pay as close attention as you can and go beyond the sound bites, and I think you'll then participate in helping create a better United States of America 10, 15, 20 years from now. So I thank you all. I'll leave it there, and if anybody has any questions, I'd certainly be willing to answer them.
You want to call on people yourself, or would you like me to do it?
You can do it, because you know them better there.
Okay, questions?
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very informative. I wondered whether you would be able to speculate on how this thing is going to play out. One of the possible dangers is that the new immigration bill that will come will be so completely unaffordable or unworkable that it will do nothing to diminish the number of undocumented workers in the United States who do not have the wherewithal to get in. And all it will do is to open up the door for the H-1B type of corporate gerrymandering of the immigration process.
Yeah, well, the cost issue is already a big one. I mean, the fees that the United States has repeatedly increased over the last several years for applications, for immigration applications, for photos, for everything you name, it's increased. And one group will benefit substantially from this immigration reform, and that is immigration lawyers are going to have a field day, because there's going to be so much changing of the laws that people are going to need lawyers, and hopefully nonprofit groups will develop a greater capacity to be able to assist people without gouging them. Because right now, you know, immigrants are gouged on a daily basis by unscrupulous lawyers who promise them the moon and the stars, and then they won't even answer their phone calls after they get their fees. So that's going to be a huge problem. I'm told that the bill may be 600 pages. That's how complicated it is. And of course, it will all be in obtuse language that only lawyers can understand. And so it's going to be very important for ordinary working class immigrants to have access to assistance in navigating the newly transformed immigration law legal system that will result from this.
I just have a question about what your opinion is on what's going on in like the Arab countries, and you know the uprisings, and a lot of people are trying to come here for religious or political asylum. Just wanted to get your opinion on that.
Well, that's a little far afield from what we're talking about here, but I would just say that U.S. policy has not only been political in terms of its in immigration, in terms of normal immigration. It has been especially political in terms of refugee admissions. Our government, unfortunately, has always used refugee admissions as a means of accomplishing other foreign policy goals. For instance, the classic example is the way Cubans and Haitians are treated, the very different systems that Cubans and Haitians are treated with when they come to South Florida or other parts of the United States. When the first Cuban mass migrations occurred into the United States in the 1960s after the Cuban Revolution, it was largely a middle-class, educated migration of people opposed to the Castro government. The United States government opened its arms to the Cuban refugees. It not only provided all kinds of extra assistance programs with the Cuban Adjustment Act of 1962, it actually shortened the time required to become a citizen from 5 to 3 years. Whereas the Haitians have been routinely locked up in immigration detention and repatriated to Haiti. And also, when you compare that to the Salvadoran and the Guatemalan refugees of the 1980s, tens of thousands of Salvadorans fled the civil war there, but virtually none of them, about 2%, who applied for refugee status in the United States were granted refugee status. Why? Because our government was allied with the government in El Salvador that was killing them. And so we couldn't very well, grant refugee status from a government that was an ally. And so I think even now in the Middle East, you will see playing out on the refugee front, political policies of our government. Clearly, Iraqi refugee applications will continue to increase as they did after Vietnam, of Vietnamese applicants that were close to or allied with the U.S. government policy. But it remains to be seen whether applicants from Bahrain or Syria or other countries are also given the same kind of refugee status by the United States based on the political considerations that our government feels it needs to deal with at that particular time. So refugee policy, unfortunately, has not been based on true humanitarian situations, but it's been depended more on how you deal with what the U.S. interests are in that particular country.
From what I caught from what you said earlier, basically America takes immigrants from other countries to do any type of labor work, no matter if it's technical or it's simple farm work. But if that's what's been going on since the beginning of time, since America started, wouldn't the new immigration laws just be time repeating itself with more of a structured way of basically saying that we're going to take all the good things from other countries, bring them here, use them out, and then at the same time deplete other countries of their natural resource? I
think that the question now in terms of immigration in the United States and also in Europe, because Europe is facing a lot of the same problems, is that unless something is done about the huge disparities in income between the West and the third world, nothing is going to stop the fleeing of people to the West. It's that simple. I mean, why I say that I believe undocumented immigration is largely a binational problem between the United States and Mexico is that Mexico is the largest Spanish-speaking country in the world, right? Much bigger than Spain in population. It has a 2,000-mile border with the United States, the only place on the planet where a developed industrial country has a contiguous land border with a third world developing country. And the Mexican people are desperately poor and in the last few years there's been a slight improvement, but for the last 30 or 40 years, the gap has only grown wider between the United States and Mexico. So it is impossible to maintain a situation where you have one economy, because the United States and Mexico are both part of NAFTA, it's one economic system, but two vastly different wage scales for the peoples in that economy. So unless something is done to increase the income level in Mexico, Mexicans are going to continue to flee. Mexico's greatest export right now is its people. In terms of the numbers that have left. No country has seen more people leave in such a short period of time as a percentage of its population. And it's going to continue to be, and as soon as the American economy ramps back up again, you know, they're going to need more construction, more housing construction workers, more gardeners, more laborers. So we've got to do something about increasing the wage structure, not only in Mexico, but in many of the third world countries, so that people don't feel forced to leave. Because the other, you know, everyone talks about globalization. We're in the era of globalization, and there's no borders to capital. Well, guess what? The other side of capital is labor. People are moving. You know, in parts of the Middle East, the immigrant population is bigger than the existing population in places like Kuwait and Bahrain and there's huge immigrant populations because the wealthy countries are so wealthy that they're drawing all of these folks who can't find work in their own countries. So I think that's the root cause of this incredible mass migration is the deepening division between the advanced world and the developing world. So that's got to be changed, or the immigration problem will continue to exist. I think, you know, there's a line in the film where one of the Mexican community leaders along the border walking along the wall that the United States has built between Mexico and the United States. I mean, this is like, you know, I said in my book it's not nearly as impressive as the Great Wall of China, and the Great Wall of China didn't help China very much in terms of preventing the Mongolians from entering their country. But he has a line in there. He says, like President Kennedy once told me, show me a 50-foot wall, I'll show you a 51-foot ladder. That's the reality, that these flows can't be controlled unless you deal with the root causes of what has propelled them to leave.
I'm looking for students over faculty.
Hi, thank you. What do you foresee is the role that young children will play in this? Young children entering first grade that are undocumented to high school students that are also undocumented?
Well, I think the one good part of the coming immigration reform is clearly that I think all sides agree that the first group that needs to be able to have an expedited route to permanent residency and to citizenship are the dreamers, the people who came here as children not through no decision of their own, but because their parents brought them here, and who are now identify themselves more as being Americans and yet do not have legal status. So I think that that part of the legislation will move fairly quickly. The problem is that then you run into this situation where the children are documented, but the parents may not be. And of course, depending on how the law is structured, for instance, there's some talk that the bill may require you to have proof of continuous residency in the United States for 3 years. Otherwise, you would not be eligible. So if you don't have that proof, or if you left the country and came back again within the last 3 years, then you would not be eligible under the current system, under the current proposed reform, to be able to regularize your status. And in that case, you'd still be potentially subject to deportation. And this whole issue of families being torn apart with the parents being deported and the children staying here is really something that goes against, sort of the grain of basically common sense and humanity in the United States. So I think that that's going to become a subject of debate in terms of, okay, you give the dreamers status, but what about their parents? And then, of course, the gets even further, because then you're dealing with what about adult children? It's a complicated issue. The family reunification, which has been a centerpiece of U.S. immigration policy now for decades, is going to be under severe strain because, what about the grandparents? Can they eventually get status? It's all of this has to be. That's why I say the bill's going to be like 600 pages, because it's going to have to deal with a lot of stuff. It's a very, very complex issue. It's almost like healthcare reform, or the NAFTA bill. It's going to be this giant, giant bill that every word in it is going to be fought over by somebody, and we won't know, because we still have not seen. No one has seen an actual bill. The first one will be introduced. There's been some individual pieces of legislation in the House, but no one has seen yet a bill, and that's going to be released either Friday or early next week. And that's the so-called Gang of 8 bill of John McCain, Lindsey Graham, 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats in the Senate will introduce the bill in the next few days.
Thank you for coming. I was wondering, I know you touched upon it just right now, but I was wondering about this reform, the immigration reform, and I was wondering, where are we there now? What's going on right now? Because I know it was kind of put on the back burner a little bit.
Well, that's what I said, that in the next few days there will be a bill introduced in the Senate. It will then have to be, hold hearings and debates and amendments, and then the Senate will hopefully pass something. We don't know what it will be yet. And then the House will introduce a worse bill. Whatever comes out of the Senate will definitely be worse coming out of the House. But then, as happens in the United States, when two houses approve bills that are at odds with each other, they appoint what's called a reconciliation committee that then tries to reconcile and create a hybrid of the two bills, and then that has to go to a vote in both houses again, and then it has to be signed by the president. So we're really only at the beginning of this process. But the president and the leaders of the House and the Senate have all said they want to have a bill by the fall. So this is when the debate is occurring right now. It'll be, and you're going to be hearing a lot about it on TV, most of it inaccurate or shallow. So you're going to have to find other sources to get your information. And that's why I recommended one group, the Migration Policy Institute, which does excellent in-depth studies of all kinds of issues. But there'll be many others, the Brennan Institute. There'll be lots of groups that will be doing analyses and providing information on what the actual impact of these bills will be on real life.
Many of the Hispanic workers that come here are getting paid very low wages. Some of these farm and migrant workers, and you're supposed to get paid an equal day's pay for an equal day's work, and yet there seems to be being illegally paid under that. What's in the bill to do? What is in the bill to try to solve the wage disparity problem once they actually get here, so they can have a real living wage?
Well, that's one of the things that we will find out soon. What will be the like for instance, on this new W visa thing that I talked about, which was guest workers who work in hotels, in maintenance, I forget what other field, health, nursing, that supposedly, we're told, we haven't seen the language, the bill will require that workers who are sponsored by employers to come in from other countries will be paid the prevailing wage in that industry, in that region of the country, or the minimum wage, whichever is greater. But I'll have to see the language. That's what we've been told. One thing you know about, you must learn about lawmaking is don't listen to what's said. Read the law, because unless you actually see the law, you don't really know what's been put into effect. So that's what's being discussed there. On agriculture, that's a whole different thing. The federal minimum wage in terms of agriculture has always been a real problem, and it's think that it's not just the minimum wage. It's also because when farm workers go to work on farms for an extended period of time, they need housing. They need certain job protections, and what will be the working conditions that farmers and agribusiness will provide the workers that they recruit and essentially ship into the country because they pay their airfare or their train fare to get here. What will be the conditions under which they work? So that's still to be seen when the bill is proposed.
Thank you for taking my question. The visa changes you've mentioned don't deal with the people who are already here in terms of responsibility for those who employ documented workers. What is your opinion about either placing restrictions or punishing those that use undocumented workers to try and stem the flow of them coming into the country?
Yeah, well, I think that the original 86 Reform Act supposedly was going to penalize employers who knowingly hired undocumented workers. And there were all kinds of penalties put into place. The problem is that different administrations after that did not enforce it. It's one thing to put a law on the books, it's another thing to enforce it. A simple way to not enforce it is not to provide enough in the budget for enforcement officers. So therefore it's on the books, but who checks, right? And I think that that's why there's an attempt not only to deal with the current population, the 11 million undocumented, but to come up with a new system of future labor flows. And that if you create a system where there's some kind of a recording of the labor flows, of who's coming in, who's coming out, who hired them, and who brought them in, then there's a better chance to be able to check up on violations, so I think that's the intent of this thing, that the bill has both a solution supposedly for the existing undocumented as well as a solution for how future workers will come into the country.
Thank you. I was just wondering, you already touched on it. What do you think will happen to the children who are born here, are Americans, but their parents are undocumented? The parents have been deported, the children have put to foster care, live with aunts or uncles. What do you think would happen to them? Would you think they will bring the parents back, having lived here for an odd number of years?
Yeah. That's a good question, and watch for that, because I'm told that is a contentious issue in the new legislation. Will those parents, if a child was here in the country, undocumented and their parents were sent home. And there's at least, I think it's something like 2,000 children who are in foster care right now in the United States because their parents were deported and they were citizens here and they stayed in the country. Or what about the dreamers who are now undocumented but will get legal status if their parents were deported? So there is supposedly a debate over putting something in the bill that would allow those parents, their children, to basically apply to have them come back, right? And to be able to be brought back. But that's not going to be an easy one to get through. And there's going to be definitely strong opposition to that. But that's definitely one to watch for. That's just one small example of the many little details that this bill will have to address in one way or another.
Hi, I was wondering, I know you touched on it a little bit already, but if you could elaborate on how much responsibility the intellectual community has in these problems, considering our government tends to speak in more opaque terms that the common man may not understand.
Well, I think it's a responsibility of the intellectual community to first familiarize itself as much as possible with the details of this debate and of the particular proposals that are going to be coming forward, and then find a way, which is what I try to do in my articles in the Daily News and in Democracy Now!, to explain it in a way that the average person can understand. That's the real challenge, because unless the average person understands what's at stake, because I get calls all the time from readers in the Daily News, which is not a progressive newspaper by any stretch of the imagination. And the readers say to me, well, my parents came here the legal way, and, why can't these people come in legally? Well, they just don't know the history. When most folks came, with the exception of the Chinese who were excluded, most immigrants who came from Europe, there was no question of you being legal. If you could come here and get to Ellis Island and you did not have disease of one kind or another, you were admitted. The country wasn't like excluding people. The country needed labor. It was eager to get as many people as possible to come to the country and settle. And so this issue of legality and illegality is a relatively new question, with the exception of the Chinese, until the middle to the late 20th century. That is when the immigration quotas were developed in Europe for Europeans in the 1920s. That was the first beginning of, hey, only certain people can be admitted in. But then what happened? Within a few years, World War II broke out, and nobody came here from Europe. In fact, the period of least immigration to the United States was the period between the 1920s and the 1950s, because there was such turbulence and war in Europe, and then that very few Europeans came. That's why so many African Americans were brought up from the South during World War II, because there wasn't enough labor during the war to man the industry. And so they brought up Mexicans with the Bracero program that started in 1942. They brought up African Americans, and they brought up Puerto Ricans to fill the industry, starting in the 40s and into the 50s. So there wasn't really the question of legality and illegality until about the 60s. That became, so I think that we got to understand our history as an immigrant nation to see that, and again, I want to stress, immigration law is not the Ten Commandments. It's not eternal, immutable truths. It's a decision that's made by leaders as to who gets into the country and under what conditions. And that's all it is. So therefore, you've got to it's like prohibition, or it's like marijuana or drug laws. It's the issue is there are differences of opinion on what's right or what's wrong, but at a particular time the society passes a law. But we're not talking about murder or rape or anything like that. We're talking about policies of the government.
Can we take one more question, and then we'll break until 2, and then at 2 we will start the student panel.
I just have a comment, and I want to say thank you for your presentation. Welcome to the plight, the struggles of similar experiences. United States has a history and is repetitive in how it handles and deals with its people. It has a problem, and always has, with Native Americans, Indians, blacks, and it's still trying to solve the problems of affirmative action. And I just like to say that between the lines, it's going to be a dangerous read. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much for being so attentive for such good questions.
Right, so it's 2:10, so I guess we should proceed with this student panel. Welcome, everybody. I'm Professor Bejar Lopez from the Department of Political Science. And today, we have a very good student panel here. They are going to talk about, or to give their opinions about the talk that Juan Gonzalez gave a few minutes ago. The way this is going to work is I'm going to introduce all of them first. Basically, I'm going to tell you their names, majors, and some of them actually send me their accomplishments in life, which is kind of cool and very good. And then, I'm going to give them each 5 minutes to give their opinion about the talk. And after that, Juan is going to respond to them after they all say whatever they have to say. For all you guys, you have 5 minutes, and I'm going to let you know when you only have 1 minute to go in your presentation. So first of all, we have Amanda Clarke. She is Amanda. Can you please say hi to people so they know who you are? She's a major in history and a minor in political science and Latin American studies, and she plans to attend law school. She's going to graduate in the spring, and then she plans to attend law school. Sebastian, he is from Colombia. Sebastian is to my left. He's from Paterson, New Jersey, and he's the news director and host of Latin Flavors for William Paterson University radio station. So I assume he plays some salsa and bachata during some of his shows. Eric Dolan, he's a sophomore in the Department of Political Science with minors in social justice and media studies. And he is the founder and president of WP United, and also director of college radio Day Records. He's to my right. Edgar Hernandez, he's a double major in psychology and Latin American studies. He transferred to William Paterson from Mercer County Community College. He's from Trenton, New Jersey, and he has a Hispanic heritage. He plans to go to grad school and pursue a PhD in counseling and also a master's in Latin American studies. Carolina James, she is an English writing major with certification in secondary education. She's also from Hispanic descent. She's Dominican and born and raised in Paterson, New Jersey. Kathleen, Revilla. She is going to graduate, hopefully, in May with a double major in chemistry and anthropology. She's Peruvian, or has heritage from Peru, and she hopes to pursue a career advocating for patients in hospitals in the United States, or more specifically New Jersey, I guess. And that's it. We are missing one of the guys who was supposed to be here, who didn't show up, but we have a very good panel. So, just for the purpose of organization, why don't we start or do this in alphabetical order? So, the first one is Amanda Clarke.
Thanks.
So please feel free to start this discussion.
Okay. I'm so lucky I get to go first. I thought it was really interesting how you said that the media shapes and provides the perception for most of the stereotypes that people associate with immigrants. And I think it kind of develops from, not to say ignorance, because that's kind of a strong word, but kind of lack of education into the actual situation. He is right when he said that schools don't provide information into Latin America. I remember when I went to high school, I didn't have any Latin American courses. I didn't come to college planning to be a Latin American Studies minor. I took a course in Latin American study. I took a course in, my first one, I think it was just a broad overview of the subject. But I took a course there and I actually learned about it. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. I liked it, and then I took another one. But you never really hear about the history. You only hear what the news depicts, and it's such an inaccurate perception. So I really liked how he said that. And then I also had a question. Since immigration is so ingrained with income inequality, do you think that this is a situation that can be addressed just on a U.S. basis, or do you think that this is an international problem and it needs to have international solutions? You mentioned that Germany, France, and England are all facing problems with immigration. Do you think that it can be addressed solely within the U.S. court system, or do you think that it needs to take another route? I also wanted to ask you if you thought that there was an adequate and fair and just way to kind of solve the immigration problem. You kind of went over the critiques, but do you think that there is a fair way, and do you think that will come to a fair conclusion once all is said and done? And then I also thought it was interesting how you said that it was in 2006 when the protests came about, when they were trying to make employers who employed undocumented workers a felony, that's kind of when the whole situation started. I've come to realize that people don't come to accept change until their status is being questioned. Like the the Republicans are changing their views with immigration because the Latino population is such a rising force in the country now. I don't think there would be any legislation going on right now if they weren't such a rising population. So I'd like to end and just say thank you for coming today. I really did appreciate your speech, and I hope you answer my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Very interesting questions. So next online is Sebastián Escobar.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez, for your talk. It was very informative. It was great. One issue that I wanted to touch upon was the dreamers, and another issue that a lot of the dreamers face here in the United States is fear. They have a lot of fear engraved in them, in the fact that not only are they undocumented, but they came to the United States with the opportunity. Well, their parents sent them to the United States with the opportunity that they were going to have a great education, and they were going to have a great life in this country because of the turmoil back in their country and the lack of opportunities back in their country. And what I wanted to touch upon was the fear that is engraved because they're undocumented, and the fact that they no longer have a work permit or a driver's license, and that they have to go to work or to school without a driver's license, and the fear that they're going to get pulled over and possibly get deported or sent to a detention center. So with Congress, hopefully, maybe reviewing the DREAM Act and the immigration reforms, and hopefully allowing our dreamers and our undocumented students who really want to come to this country for a better education. Because personally, I know a couple of my friends, citizens who don't take the opportunity, who don't take all the resources they're given as American citizens to go to school and to learn and to have a better education and possibly a better life. But I have friends who are undocumented who want to learn, who want to go to school, but they can't because, number one, they can't possibly afford it. They don't have the aid. They don't have the federal aid or, to go to school, or because of the fear of driving to school and possibly getting stopped by a police officer for whatever reason. And, hopefully that all changes with the new immigration reform. Also, I wanted to touch on the identity crisis that Latinos face in the United States as well. And that, personally for me growing up, I was always, kids are just cruel. So I was ridiculed because I don't really look Latino. I don't look Spanish. I have a very light complexion. So no one really considered me Latino, but I know because of my background and my culture that I am Latino. And I wanted to express that more and more when I grew up. And that's probably, that's another issue that Latinos face in the United States is that, what are they considered? Because now with the Census Bureau they have, are you white, non-Hispanic, or black, non-Hispanic, or Hispanic white, or Hispanic black? So now is the issue of identity, what are Latinos going to be considered now in the United States? Because they're both, light and dark, but some in the middle. And overall, I think, the way you touched upon every issue and every topic was great. And hopefully the dreamers get what they deserve, and that's a better education and a better life to come to be part of the United States. And also that we apprehend the identity crisis that Latinos also face here in the United States, because it's very well deserving.
Thank you, Sebastian. Eric Dolan from the Department of Political Science.
Yes. First and foremost, thank you so much for coming to William Paterson and speaking about such an important issue. I wanted to preface what I was planning on saying by stating first and foremost that I will never be able to understand what it is like to not have papers, what it is like to live in a state of fear and undocumentation. And how important it is for people in the media. I'm a journalist. I'm hoping to advocate for social justice. I'm hoping to tell stories of people. And I've been able to see firsthand and through your words the importance the media has in shaping perceptions. And we talk about the negative side of that, the soundbite generation, the short attention spans, the way that people get labeled and stereotyped. But there's an extremely positive side of the media, which is where my questions to you come, and how to harness that positive side. I'm extremely lucky to be taking a human trafficking class, and what we've learned thus far is to move massive amounts of population and to be paying people below a living wage puts them at an extreme level of vulnerability. It's something that is so simple to say in a speech, but so difficult to actually understand, because I personally will never be able to understand that. And so where does the responsibility lie for journalists? Where does the responsibility lie for media outlets to put a face and to tell these stories? Because these are people who are at the highest risk of being exploited in regards to sex slavery or working in a domestic situation in which they're not receiving the amount of money needed to have a healthy living wage. They're not being treated like equals. And so my questions to you revolve around the notion that how do we as journalists, and more importantly, how do we as basic human beings, as a 19-year-old white male, how do I, in not only my everyday life, but in my media exploits and my desire to tell these stories, how do I approach this? How do I, you've been able to meet so many people and tell so many stories and live it firsthand, but someone like me, how do I actually go about making these stories happen. And lastly, I wanted to close with one final thought, which was that we did talk quite a bit about the media. And more importantly, as a person, as a college student, what could I be doing in regards to helping advocate for these issues, either through your experiences or things that I may not even know of, whether it be every day, whether it be in passing conversations, or whether it be in front of a microphone in front of people. How do I, as a 19-year-old college student, to my fullest capacity, advocate for the needs of these people, people who I will never be able to fully understand what they're going through, but want to, through my art of speaking and communication, to help in every way possible. And thank you again for your time.
Thanks, Eric. Next is Edgar Hernandez.
I'd like to first thank you, Juan Gonzalez, for being here and informing us of a lot of things that, filling in the holes for things that have happened between the book and the movie and what happened until today. I'd like to start first. You mentioned you're from Aguadilla. I'm from Aguada, which is right next to each other. My father is a Puerto Rican man. He work hard, and through my family, being Puerto Rican, the way I saw immigration at the beginning was as I wasn't a part of it, and I believe this is an issue that happens with other Latinos in the United States that had the chance to have their rights since they were born. People that were born here and don't have to worry about the undocumented, even though they may be parts of our families that we don't even know yet. So growing up, I was always seen as as Escobar, Pablo, as a little white boy, and as by my skin and my race. But being called Mexican after I came back from Puerto Rico shouldn't have been demeaning to me. It should have been demeaning to the person telling me that I was Mexican because of what I looked like and because I spoke Spanish. And I believe that this is something that the ones that we have the chance to be legal in this country, that we don't see how much of those that don't have it want it. And as a human being, we have to realize that categories weren't made to be put together, but to separate each other. So when I am called Mexican, I didn't like it. My father was like, "You're not Mexican, you're Puerto Rican," and I thought that there was a reason behind that. That it was that Puerto Ricans at one point is better than being Mexican. But that's not the case. The case is that I am Puerto Rican and I'm also Latino as long as I live, and I'll be the same as the Mexican who has to come and work hard and jump a border to be here undocumented and be the same as I do, and I don't give them the same amount of respect, and the government doesn't give them the same amount of human rights as they will give to me, who I may take for granted certain things that they will never have in their lives. So in my perspective, coming in, I saw Mexicans as an outside, and this showed me that there is a battle between Latinos to begin with. So if there's a battle amongst the ones that want to win a bigger battle, then that bigger battle won't be won until we as Latinos come together. And I see it in my own home where I have to argue with my own family about different Latinos and how they are equal to us, and sometimes they have struggled more than us to get the same things that we have, and sometimes worse than things that we have. So I find that is the main core for Latinos right now. I feel that is the most important thing, is to stop the hatred between ourselves and amongst ourselves because of the labels that we're given as legal and illegal. And if they do call us illegal, even when we're not, just turn our cheeks and say, I'm not illegal, undocumented, even though I am a citizen of this country. Because they will never know the difference. And we have to find a way to come together for that. And one thing that I'm pretty sure Sue Kenny would have asked, and she didn't get the chance to because there was a lot of other questions, was about human rights and how they're being detained in prisons. I find that is very heart-wrenching for me because I didn't think my own country, this country, the United States, would do such a thing and have it hidden behind walls. As Sue came, when she came a few months behind, she talked about how they'll take in people who have no records at all. As a matter of fact, they say that, half the immigrants in detention centers, they don't have any record at all, any criminal record. So why are they there? So with this reformation, what's going to happen with those people that are being detained? Are they shipped back? Are they given a chance here? Or is there something more, like money, being involved with these people being in these prisons that is holding them back to showing to the public what exactly is going behind certain prison walls? And that is something that I'm basing a lot of my research on right now, especially in Professor Sabagal's class, is human rights. I believe that human rights belong to all of us. It's not American rights, it's not Puerto Rican rights, it's not Dominican rights, it's human rights. So if they're human rights, and if we're human, you should have them, even if you are undocumented in this country. So I just want to know what you have, what's your take on that? Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Edgar. There is indeed nothing wrong about being Mexican, and I can attest that. Next is Carolina James.
Okay. First and foremost, I want to say to Juan Gonzalez, thank you for coming. And it's been really interesting reading up on you and all the things that you have done. And I really think it takes a strong and a humble person to stand up for the things that you have stood up thus far, because it's not easy. I'm not one to always look at things from a political aspect, but I do understand that many times politically is where these changes need to happen. But I feel like I'm going to take this and look at it from an educational standpoint. I'm a true advocate for culturally responsive teaching, which came about from Geneva Gay, and which in terms mean that the school system should be a direct reflection of the students in the classroom. So when looking at these lawmaking policies and immigration reforms, it makes me wonder what direct impact will these reforms have on our educational systems? Because I feel thus, for instance, I work in Paterson, New Jersey at a school which is predominantly 85% Dominican migrant students. Whether they're undocumented or not, that might not be the case, but most of them are Spanish-speaking students. Half of the time, the students are not engaged because they're learning things that they have no idea and they can't directly relate to what they're seeing. So I just wonder, with all these law policies being thrown out, and let's say, yes, they are granted documents, what vehicle is going to take place in the school systems where we're going to walk away from what people tend to define as multicultural, but mark it as just once a month or once a week, or everyone let's bring a plate of food and call that multicultural week. I feel that we have to walk away from that and look at multicultural as it encompasses everyone. We shouldn't just single out African Americans is in February or Dominicans is this month. So I feel when looking at immigration, we also have to look deeply into education system, because that's the way we actually are gonna make people aware, because education, it's the end of all. Like, I feel without education, you're not gonna make any changes. And directly stating that, coming from Paterson and my mom, it's funny because right now Paterson Board of Education elections are taking place. And I asked my mother, are you going to vote? Her first reaction was, I only vote for the presidential elections. And I know, looking at it from my community personally, we tend to rally out when it comes to presidential elections, but that many times doesn't trickle down to our communities and the laws and policies that are being voted in. So I feel like with immigration reform law, who's going to go out to these communities and make them aware that they actually have to step up and vote for these law policies that are taking place? Because it's one thing that they're going to be granted, but in essence, is the whole community as a whole going to have a say in these policies and laws? Because I feel that one way or another, there's going to be someone on the losing end. And a lot of times we might feel like we're winning something, but there's something that's going to be taken away. And that's the part that scares me, and it scares me for the future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. Kathleen Revilla.
also wanted to say thank you to Juan Gonzalez for coming in and teaching us so much in such a short amount of time. You had mentioned that a lot of the largest transnational companies have started really and taken hold in these Latin American countries, and that is where the root of a lot of this migration has come from. And I was curious how you thought that was related to the historic relationship that, the First World or the Global North has constantly throughout history gone into these places that have not been as developed and taken everything that they wanted and taken what they wanted and then blamed them for not being able to get ahead and blamed them for being from that area and for not being as good as they were. And if you thought that there might be, because I believe it's undeniable to say that our political system is intrinsically related to corporate America right now as it stands. I mean, Monsanto just passed a law, so they don't have to go through anything. I mean, we have these constant episodes where corporations are almost above the law, and our politics worked for the advantage of these larger corporations while us, we don't see what happens because of those laws necessarily. We don't get the benefits of these laws. And I was wondering if you thought that the relationship between free trade capitalism in our country and the politics, that immigration might be better addressed through labor reform, through trade reform, because to say that they can bring in, I forgot what you called them, the blue card and the W visas and the H-1B visas, to say, you can come here and we're going to take the greatest people out of your place and we're going to pay you guys less anyway, that we're just essentially making this almost serfdom legal. We're saying, oh, well, we're going to keep taking stuff, but now it's okay because now we made a structure for it. So would it be better suited to go through these corporations and to say, you have to pay people a certain amount. People need a living wage. You can't go into places and practice these things that are unsustainable because you're forcing people to leave their homes and come here, where we're criticizing them and judging them for being illegal, for being undocumented. So would that be another avenue that could address that? Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. We had several questions for Juan. All of them are very interesting, ranging from income inequality to education and other issues that hopefully Juan is going to address in the next few minutes. We have 15-20 minutes for your response. Let me just say that it's incredibly warm in here. So just if you guys noticing, we are sweating a lot, just as Marco Rubio did during his response to Obama a couple of months ago, and this actually goes along with this whole immigration reform topic. So I'm glad we all are thinking the same. Juan, please.
Well, thank you all for such thoughtful responses and questions. From what I can just tell, the questions seem to center around three sort of thought points or themes. One is the role of education in better understanding the situation with immigration and Latinos, the role of journalism and the media, and the role of economic policy in terms of addressing some of these questions. And I think with the, let me deal with the economic question, because I do think that is central to all of this debate, not only here in the United States, but in Europe over the immigration crisis. And it also deals not only with what Kathleen said, but what Amanda raised about, do you think this can be a US-based solution or an international solution to the problem? I think the reality is that the economic system of the United States and Europe has really benefited dramatically from immigration throughout the history of the country. Like if you go back to early colonial times, William Penn, who was the founder of Pennsylvania, recruited all these people from different Germanic territories to come to the American colony of Pennsylvania, and he used labor recruiters. He hired people in Germany to go throughout different cities and towns in Germany to convince Germans to come and settle in America. So there's always been the American experiment is not simply an experiment in democracy. It's been a huge experiment in land speculation and in labor exploitation. And the immigration has played a critical role, because let's remember this, when the first settlers arrived in North America, there were between 12 and 15 million native peoples at different levels of development in North America. And the entire process of building this country has been a process of taking other people's land and then settling that land with immigrant labor and with slave labor as well, those who were kidnapped. And so it's not a pretty picture when you look at how the whole country developed. So I think that economics has always been at the root of immigration, getting enough workers in a particular place to build wealth. So right now, free trade policies have played a critical role in creating the incentives and the machinery by which labor ends up coming to the United States. I give the example in my book of San Pedro de Macorís in the Dominican Republic, which is a place where all the great Dominican ball players come from. When I went to San Pedro in 1992, there was a free trade zone on the outskirts of San Pedro that employed 43,000 people in about 98 factories. Most of the people were young women, 16 to 25. They were all getting paid about $2 a day to work in these various factories. It was like a city of factories, industrial park. This was 1992. The place did not exist in 1980. The free trade zone did not exist. It sprouted up almost overnight after the Caribbean Basin Initiative. The first example of free trade in the Caribbean was passed by the Reagan administration. And what ended up happening is a lot of people get recruited into the free trade zones, whether it's in San Pedro in the Dominican Republic, or San Pedro Sula in Honduras, or Juarez and Reynosa in Mexico. And as soon as they get acculturated to American way of doing business, and they realize that they're getting paid $2 or $4 or $10 a day, and all they have to do is get to the United States, and the minimum they'll get is $5, $6, $7 an hour. They follow the same logic that capital followed to come to their countries. Capital went to the cheapest place and continues to go to wherever they can get labor the cheapest. And that's why China has become the industrial heartland of the world in the last 20 years. But labor does the same thing. Labor goes to where it can get the best price for its labor. So that's why economic policy is at the root of mass migration. The more you equalize labor costs, the more that, and I'm not saying you have to have the same labor costs in Mexico or Dominican Republic or Peru that you have in the United States, but you've got to have something that is halfway decent or people can survive on. So I think that's at the root of it, economic policy. Does it have to be an international solution? Ultimately, yes. But some countries have to start the ball rolling and go in a better direction. And I think that we don't have a responsibility for what the English people do or the French people do or the German people do. We do have a responsibility for what the American people do. And I think that's the problem that we've got to solve. On the question of education, I agree that education is at the heart of both the overall American population getting a better understanding of the problem and of Latino youth and other immigrants being able to grasp their role in helping to change the society. And I think that the better educated you become, the more you're able to educate other people. So I think that that there's been a huge advance in the issue of a more multicultural and less chauvinist education system in America over the last 30, 40 years. It has not been easy, as many of the professors and scholars will tell you, that it's been a pitched battle in academia over going away from a Euro-centered system of education to a more world-based system of education. But there has been progress, and there's more opportunity now to get information you couldn't get previously. So I think that, but that there's got to be more attention paid to a deeper understanding. And unfortunately, you know, there's been a lot said about how the internet can liberate humanity, but that was said about cable television, it was said about radio, it was said about all the new media technologies that developed. Each one was supposed to liberate humanity. Unfortunately, I think that there is a definite negative side about the internet's impact on educating people, is that people do have less attention spans, less willingness to read in depth. I don't know how many of you, when you do searches, go beyond page 3 or 4 of the searches that Google or Yahoo or somebody else has, according to their own algorithms, decided you should see. But even when you get on a site, if you have a long report on that site, how many of you actually will take the time to read the entire thing, and not just try to get the executive summary or the short version of it? So I think that the very medium is promoting a shallow investigation of life, and there's got to be a way for us to break through that and continue to look deeper into problems. The more deeply you look into a problem, the more knowledgeable you get about it, and the more you can help educate other people. On the issue of the role of journalists, and I think that Eric raised the question of being able to put a face to the stories, and how can you advocate. I'm a firm believer that good journalism is journalism that is closest to home. It's very easy to write journalism and to investigate stuff that is far away and never ruffles any feathers of the people that you actually deal with on a daily basis. When you begin to do your journalism right at home, you often get into opposition, as somebody said, within their own family, or with people that you know or friendly to. I think that you could do a lot of work right here in this town and in this county, looking at what is happening to immigrants, undocumented immigrants right here. How will the new policies affect them? Some folks who've spoken to you before have told you about this huge growth of what I call the border security industry. It's a whole new industry. When I said there was, $17 billion being spent, somebody's making a lot of money off of getting the country to worry about border security. There's local towns that are now renting out their jails to the immigration authorities so that they can keep detainees. They make money off of it. The companies that provide all of this new e-verify systems to track identities of people, they're making money off of it. The people that are designing these electronic fences and now the drones that are flying along the Mexican border, taking surveillance shots of who's coming in, who's coming out, they're making money. There's a lot of people making money off of border security. And I suspect that if you dug deep, right into this university, right into the professors. And if you try to do a story about how many professors, and they probably have to talk to you without names attributed, employed at one point or another undocumented people in their households, or what the local county jail is doing, or what the local authorities are doing in terms of immigration, you'd find stories, valuable stories that would help illuminate this is a very complex problem, and that is one that needs a comprehensive solution. And on the issue of the dreamers and the identity crisis that Sebastian raised, something that's really unique has happened in the United States, the development of the Latino population, which is that there is a whole new hybrid thing called the Latino in America that has developed. Because people and their families came from different countries, but they arrived in the United States, and largely because of the segregation policies that not direct policies, but de facto segregation that arose. In Southern California, Mexicans marry Salvadorans, and their children are something new. They're part Mexican, they're part Salvadoran, but they're now this new thing with the Latino in America. In Florida, Cubans married Colombians or Venezuelans and their children, and then they intermarried. In New York and other places, Puerto Ricans married Dominicans, and now their children are something, it's like there's been a hybrid creation of a new thing called the Latino in America. It's a subset, linguistic and cultural minority within the larger American context that is neither exactly part of the original group, but is not yet part wholly of American society. And yet it is influenced by African American culture and mores, by white American culture and mores, and it's really a new mosaic that's developed in the United States that is particular to the United States. Now, again, this is not the only place it's happening. I know a professor at Cal State Northridge who's Peruvian, who has been studying the rise of Ecuadorian and Peruvian and South American press in Spain, because the individual immigrants who came to Spain from the Dominican Republic, from Peru, from Ecuador, felt discriminated against within Spain. They had to set up their own media and their own voices to be heard. So it's part of the sort of worldwide movement of peoples that these subsets are developing culturally in these countries that are neither part of the sender country nor part of the receiving country, but this new thing. And I think that hasn't been sufficiently sort of examined. And of course, there's also intermarriage with African Americans and with whites of different nationalities or ethnic groups. But to me, the big intermarriage and the big cultural amalgamation has occurred within the Latino community itself. And I think that needs to be explored in terms of what does that mean about identity, and how do you understand your history and your culture if you're part Mexican and part Peruvian and part Irish and yet not quite accepted as part of the general American society. But there's two ways to look at it. This is a confusing mess, or it's really a huge, exhilarating opportunity, something new that's coming into being. So I think that those are the, and also Edgar mentioned the question of trying to eliminate the hate and divisions within the Latino community. I don't know how many of you saw the film Harvest of Empire, but there's a great interview there with Junot Diaz, who is really, has to be right now probably the most well-known and celebrated Latino author in America. It's won every prize you can imagine now. But Junot talks about how he grew up in Paterson, New Jersey, is that his parents brought him here from the Dominican Republic, and about the racism that he encountered, not just from white society, but from black society and from other Latinos. And that there are divisions within the Latino community, not just between nationality, but racial. Latinos brought their own racial prejudices, and then that was reinforced by the existing prejudices in the United States. That lighter was always better and darker was always worse, and about the saying that we have in Puerto Rico, "Y tu abuela dónde está?" And your grandmother, where is she? What are you hiding in terms of your racial background and history? That I think has to be confronted as well. And that increasingly now in many cities, you're seeing situations where young Dominicans and Puerto Ricans are like bullying or mistreating more recent Mexican immigrants, and there's a sort of gradation that's developed in how American you are. My wife is a Spanish language high school teacher, and she taught for many years in the public schools, and she always told me that she was shocked, because she's from the Dominican Republic, and she was shocked that the biggest resistance to learning Spanish came from the Latino children, who they would tell her, "I'm American, I don't need to learn Spanish." They had, in essence, internalized the negative viewpoint that the general society had toward Latinos, and that as their rite of passage into being more accepted, they didn't want to learn Spanish. So they resisted it. And so, which is really amazing in terms of identity and the impact, psychological impact of being part of an immigrant colonial population, how your views, you end up acting out the very prejudices that the general society has against you, either against other groups like the Mexicans or within your own community or about your own language. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I see that we have some bright minds here that are going to carry the work on in the future. But I think that you've all hit on the main points. One, the role of journalism and journalists in creating the images, to the importance of education in tearing down those stereotypes. And three, that you got to solve the economic direction or the policies, or the problem will continue to recur. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Juan, and thank you all for attending this talk. Very thoughtful responses to very thoughtful questions. Once again, thank you so much, and hopefully we will see you again in the next seminar we have. Thank you so much.
Thank you.